Do you think you've saved people's careers?
I think in the early years when people we worked with got in trouble, we helped. I mean, I always say the worst thing that you can ever hear is someone says, "Oh, you should call Matthew Freud," because it means things have gone wrong.
And they were coming to you?
Too many of them. They became sort of cannon fodder in this, voracious appetite of the media to fill pages with new angles on stories.
Have you worked with the royal family on any of this?
Of all of the up relationships, the media and the royal family are,
The most.
the most.
We're with a guest who's just sat down, and his first words have been, "I shouldn't be here." Matthew Freud, why shouldn't you be here?
I've spent 40 years hiding, not completely successfully, but I think if your role is to promote and amplify the people that you're working with, you should remain hidden mostly.
And you have.
Not completely successfully, but yes, I've tried.
So, how often do you sit-down interviews like this?
This would be my second podcast, I think. But I've probably done 5 or 6 in my life.
In your life?
Yeah.
And yet, you have been at the centre of kind of so much of our public life for decades. I don't mean to age you, but you have.
Hence, I've sensibly taken the view that unless you've got a very good reason to break cover, you probably shouldn't.
And just very quickly on that, how many of these interviews would you say were successful? How many of them not?
One was a catastrophe, and resulted in many letters of apology, and the others were fine.
I'm going to stop at this point because this is a very unorthodox way to begin a conversation, and normally we would introduce you with a sentence that said something like, "This is Matthew Freud, he's a PR guru, he's the great-grandson of Sigmund Freud, he's the brother-in-law of Richard Curtis, the inspiration, if you believe it, for Tom Wamsgans in Succession, and he's the founder of Freud's Communications." So, Matthew, you're here now. Tell us what you actually do. How does your job work?
I'm still trying to work it out, but for 40 years I have worked with people initially in the entertainment business, then in brands, in governments, in institutions, in NGOs, to try and help them tell stories.
And do they call you when they're in trouble, or do you call them when you think they need you?
The crisis stuff has emerged and changed over the decades. I think in the early years when people we worked with got in trouble, we helped, and then because we got reasonably good at it, then when people got in trouble, that terrible. I mean, I always say the worst thing that you can ever hear is someone says, "Oh, you should call Matthew Freud," because it means things have gone wrong.
And if you are getting that someone says you better call Matthew Freud, what is your job? Is your job to get them in the news or out of the news?
When someone's in the eye of a media hurricane, the job is to try and help get them through it. There's a great line from the owner of the New York Times when he was confronted with one of the people who the New York Times had properly destroyed, and he just said, "Oh, it's not your fault, it's just your turn."
So in other words, everyone in public life is going to come across.
Right. At some point, you're going to tread on a banana skin, or some aspect of your life is going to be open to public scrutiny. And I think when you take the big checks, whether it's as a CEO salary or as a entertainer or as a content provider or as a politician or whatever it is, you may or may not have read the small print. But within that small print is a pretty explicit contract that you're fair game. And so I suppose what I try and do is keep the game fairer than it actually is. Very often, people who are confronted with a crisis, and that crisis will probably be real. It'll be professional, personal. I mean, something gnarly will have happened, and the media focus on it, legitimate, right? In the vast majority of cases, will be a sideshow to what's actually going on in their life. And I suppose one of the things I help people with is to contextualize, that the media have an absolute right to be interested and opinionated about what's going on, but also to try and encourage them to deal with the actual problem.
You're talking generically, but are you thinking of a case? Are you thinking of a client? Give us an example of where this has happened.
Look, with Me Too, it happened constantly over a period of a couple of years where people were sort of rounded up and accused.
And they were coming to you?
Too many of them, yes. Most. Not, and I,
So if I said like Kevin Spacey?
So I'll swerve the I say one of the reasons why I tend not to do these things is I know far too much about far too much. So I think it's not appropriate to talk about individual cases. But look, if someone's, I mean, there was the 90s and noughties were mostly shagging crisis. I mean, that was certainly because a lot of what we did was entertainment, and so in those cases, someone's marriage is probably falling apart, or their family is in deep crisis, and that's the problem they've got to deal with. It's sometimes it's very tempting for them to try and manage the perception of what's going on, rather than actually address the reality. So very often, I think what the role of an advisor or a crisis expert is to sort of draw a line and say, look, you deal with what's going on and I'll deal with what's happening on the other side. And the aim is to make it stop as soon as you can.
Again, we're talking in generalities. What I'm interested in is, and I know you don't want to get drawn into people, but I want to know how you do it. I mean, I was in Beijing in 2008, end of the Olympic Games. You are running, or Freud is running, London House ahead of London taking over the Olympic Games. Video plays. There is a picture in the Best of British of Myra Hindley. And someone from Freud, who's there, from Freud's, is there and says, oh my God, this is a catastrophe. All the papers are about to go berserk on it. Rings you, and suddenly you manage to get it off the front pages.
So that's that's a classic banana skin where you're managing a news story, or you're managing an event, and the camera happens to find something that is not at the heart of the story. We ran BAFTA for 25 years, and there was one year where the people who rented us the red carpet forgot to shampoo it properly, and it started foaming. And despite all of the biggest film stars in the world coming to London for this magnificent film event, the story that was going everywhere was that there was a foam party outside, and the snow didn't stay, or the foam didn't stay white, and so every woman who wore a long dress suddenly had a sort of fringe of gunk around her, and that was, that you're trying to manage that in real time, in exactly the same way that your profession is observing something and trying to work out what the story is. And it happens less now, but there was a long period where what my industry did and what the media industry did was pretty in sync. There was an alignment of objectives, which was you were getting a story out.
But are you sometimes making deals? I mean, is that how it works? Are you calling up Rebecca Brooks and saying, please get that off and I will give you an exclusive with X next week?
No.
No? Have I got
Really,
the
no?
kind of the deal wrong? What is the deal then?
Look, there was definitely a period of time when the back and forth between comms people and media people was more collaborative and sort of rules based, and so it was a period of time where there was some horse trading about what was dialed up and what was dialed down. A lot of that was driven by deadlines. So you were working to a newspaper or a TV news cycle, and so therefore there was a period of time between an engagement between you and the journalist and what was going to appear in print or appear on screen. That's gone. You're now in real time with a billion points of light, and stories are breaking on social media and being commented
Because
and
you
being
can't
pulled apart.
control things in the age of social media.
Right,
That's what you're saying.
right. So at a point where someone had an exclusive story, there was a different dynamic, and it was a little easier to manage or handle, because there was probably a single point of information and you could influence that, and that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Does it make your job more difficult today to be able to do that? Because I'm thinking back. You were close to Tony Blair, probably still are. Yeah.
Yeah.
David Cameron,
Yeah.
George Osborne.
Yeah.
So you knew all the people.
Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
All the people at the seat of power in this country. You also, if I reeled off a list of kind of some of the most important CEOs or the Director General of the BBC or whoever it happens to be, you are close to all these people. You've got links.
Just because I'm old and I've been
No,
around
no,
for a
no,
long
no,
time.
no. Because you have assiduously built up a network of people who are at the most influential part. I mean, I kind of, when people try to do an anatomy of how Britain works and how decisions get made and how to influence them, I think the person who should be writing this book and understands it better than anyone else is you.
I won't. I think there was a period of time where, comms when I started in the 80s was a very, very peripheral field. A few people had press agents or, PR people, but there was very little science to it, very little influence, actually. Partly because reputation was not highly valued. Most people had a good reputation. Companies, politicians, celebrities. It was they were widely admired. And if you did have a reputation, it didn't get you much. Better table in a restaurant. The original story of ordinary person does extraordinary thing. Right?
Was enough.
Right. That was the story.
Yeah.
Extraordinary person apparently is a bit ordinary is much cheaper as a journalistic narrative, and so there was a period of time when the appetite for media to go behind the story, particularly with newspapers who no longer disseminated news because that was TV's job or the electronic media side. So it became very easy to knock people down. Hence.
So the sidebar of shame or whatever. It takes 2p.
Well, it's who haven't we done yet, right? And so rather than the role of celebrity or the role of famous people to be admired and to be aspirational, they became sort of cannon fodder in this, voracious appetite of the media to fill pages with new angles on stories. And so, everyone's flawed. Right? There is only one kind of human that I've ever run into, and that's flawed. And so there isn't anyone that you can't go, that's they're leading a secret life. They're not as
toned as they pretend to be.
Like whatever it is, you can find a way of exposing the human frailty of someone who whether or not they set out to be admired, or whether they were admired because of what they did. But fame used to be a byproduct of doing something exceptional.
Let's talk about politics then, a harder nosed version of fame. This week, The Sun, which is backing reform, is running a campaign called Britain is Broken. Do you think it's broken? And if you were in power now, how would you go about convincing the public that Britain isn't broken? I mean, it's the Labour question. Because you ask people generally what they think of Labour's time in power so far, and the best you get is a meh. There are people who are much more vociferous, people who are much more antagonistic, but generally we feel like an uninspired country at the moment with our leadership. And I wonder whether that's a branding problem or a policy problem.
I think it's a media problem. I mean, this government has been in crisis from before they were in power, right? The very sort of relentless assault on this new government as individuals and as a collective began, on polling night. So in 10 months in government, you can't actually do anything. I mean, Blair in his book on leadership, says you basically can't do much in a single term. You need 2 terms to sort of change everything. I mean, the cogs of government are very, very, very hard to shift. So realistically, wherever this government is far too early, even for an interim report card. But the narrative is they're in crisis, that they're not decisive enough, is that they flip-flop, that they take freebies, that, who paid for those glasses, or, did Angelina pay enough tax on a house that she sold 15 years ago? If the public are reliant on a narrative that is being fed through a very defined political agenda, the only thing you can do is wait and see what they.
So you're just saying it's the fault of the right wing media? I mean, is that it?
No, I'm saying that covering politics in real time is a pretty pointless pursuit, because the outputs, you have to wait. I mean, we have a legislative process that is slow. We have a data flow that is incredibly laggy. And so, I mean, if I was a spokesman for the government and I had to say, well, here are our achievements. I mean, are there any tangible achievements in the first 8-9 months? I mean, certainly from a legislative standpoint, no.
Yeah, I'm just interested in what you were saying there. But I mean, look, you've raised Angela Rayner's house sale. You've talked about the glasses and the free suits and the freebies and whatever else. Could Labour have handled it differently? Or do you think they've just got to take the medicine? There's no good storyline out of that.
I think the dangerous aspect of a media-driven narrative is that it's distracting. So trying to manage it is a waste of important time. So I think this government has spent too much time reacting to the day-to-day incoming inquiries about incredibly trivial issues.
So why didn't the government just say bugger off? I mean, should they have done?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They've got another 4 years. And realistically, the media have as much power as you give them.
Freud is one of the most famous surnames in the world. And you married a Murdoch, also one of the most famous surnames in the world. Is there such a thing as Freud traits, Murdoch traits within your family, Matthew?
I hope not on both counts. I think it's a terrible thing to do to a child, to give them that much baggage. if you grow up with a surname that's more interesting than your Christian name, there's a sort of almost a form of identity abuse.
Because it's a dynasty, not an individual.
Because people assume that you're what they think you might be, or they're immensely disinterested in anything about you other than your relatives or your, sort of, dynastic stature. I mean, I think in some ways, we're sort of lucky to have a stupid surname, but that didn't dictate what I was probably likely to do. So I think if you come from a banking family or an oil family or a media family, then the assumption is that you're going to follow the family dynamic or profession. And I also came from a family that didn't have money. So it was, in some ways, it was a more interesting challenge to try and establish some identity that was mine rather than a sort of part owned inheritance. But also you weren't burdened with a vocational imperative or a trust fund that meant that it didn't really matter what you did anyway.
I mean, I wonder if that was easier when you look at your ex-father-in-law. He's now in a trial against the rest of his children. You might kind of say he's lost that anyway if you're not talking to your own children. But do you kind of think, I mean, is that reconcilable? Does he appeal? Does that become the defining thing?
I've literally no idea or opinion. I think what I do know is that families are hard enough. Yeah. When there's a shared identity, that makes it much more difficult because everyone is reflective or reflecting on everyone else. And that's a difficult dynamic. And I think when there's a lot of money involved, that can definitely become the defining dynamic around a family. I have a degree of sympathy for people who are part of an ecosystem which, probably infantilizes them to some extent. I think the universal experience of growing up is about working out who you are.
Yeah, exactly.
And working out who you are when the rest of the world has already decided who you are is hard. And working out who you are in relation to people who you have one relationship with as a sibling or as a parent or as a ancestor makes it much harder to go through that separation from family where you establish who you are, who you want to be.
And you would never do this. But if Rupert Murdoch came to you and said, "You are the PR guru, tell me what I should be doing at this point."
So,
I mean, in this trial, what would be your advice?
So I mean, it's a good example of dealing with the real crisis, which is clearly a set of family relationships that have broken down, as opposed to what's happening in a legal system in America or what's happening with a media narrative around the world. And the temptation is to proxy a battle that is an emotional and personal one into a legal one because it's got a framework, or into a media one because it's got a narrative that can be played or manipulated.
So you'd be saying, get your relationship sorted out, forget the trial.
So you would imagine that any people who fundamentally love each other, if they're able to talk to each other openly and freely in a sort of safe-ish space, they'll probably resolve whatever difficulties they have.
Do you think so?
In my experience, yes. But I think when you outsource conflict to people whose agenda or whose objective is not to resolve that conflict but to extend it. So in a legal environment, you've got, I think there were 85 lawyers on the docket in the Nevada case. and you go, really?
Yeah.
It's surely there's a different way of doing it, or and I suppose our royal family is another example of a family who have got some difficult relationships, as every family does, but they're played out through a proxy of media coverage, and that just makes it worse.
So I'm just as an aside, and I don't know whether you answer it, but have you worked with the royal family on any of this?
I very deliberately didn't for incredibly long time, because I think the particularly of all of the up relationships, the media and the royal family are,
The most up.
the most.
But not the royal family with the royal family.
No, the royal family. I mean, if you're in a soap opera and you're not writing the script,
Yeah.
but the world perceives that whatever has just happened. I for the last 5 or 6 years, I've worked with the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, on the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which was his incredibly successful attempt to bring industries around the world together to find solutions to the climate crisis. Most of what we do as an agency, and a company is around the Sustainable Development Goals. So we were very deep into development, into health, into mental health, into sustainability, into climate, into social issues, into gender issues. So it's the sort of values of a company or an institution or an individual that I think we can help articulate.
Do you think the clock is turning back on those issues? I mean, you look at what's happening in America: environment, gender issues. It just seems that the arc of history is not bending towards justice, as Martin Luther King would say. It's kind of bending away.
We have a media company that we work with that 5 years ago was being prosecuted in America for racism. They're now being prosecuted for diversity, for promoting diversity.
No.
To some extent, particularly on sustainability, I think I did my first climate campaign in 1987. So I've sort of seen 4 cycles of the climate becoming a useful tool to being completely benign, and now for the first time probably to being a negative. So you've got companies who are now really rapidly retreating from positions they were taking, in part from a regulatory standpoint, in terms of their net zero objectives. But there's now no CEO in the world who wants to talk about sustainability.
But should you be saying, go into America with an ad campaign that talks about, climate issues and trans issues and DEI, because you'll have the whole place to yourself? No.
So I'm much more interested in truth than perception.
Yeah.
And I think the companies who were committed to diversity, were committed to the environment, were committed to the sort of planetary goals, remain committed. They're talking about it less. I think the companies that just talked about it because, their shareholders demanded it, or their bankers demanded it, or the public demanded it, they're going to talk about it, in a different way now. But the media is a very, very unreliable source of information. People, I think, no longer trust institutions, and the way that they filter the information that comes at them from social media, from conventional media, is I think quite healthy. My sense is that people actually get it right, where the media on a day-to-day basis probably quite often get it wrong. I think we do have a sense of who celebrities are, who companies are, who politicians are, and I don't think that sways with the political weather or the media's narrative.
Yeah.
And so our advice always to people is, if you want a better reputation, be better.
So let's go back to a question that Emily asked you a moment ago about, your surname being famous. You married Elizabeth Murdoch. She had a pretty famous surname as well. As far as I know, there's been no reality TV series made about the Freuds, but maybe I've missed it. But there has been sort of succession. Did you recognise it?
As brilliant television, yes. I mean, it's one of my favourite TV shows of all time.
Are you a very close friend of Jesse Armstrong, the writer?
So I've demonstrably never met Jesse Armstrong. I mean, I was a huge fan of his from Peep Show. So
because it was very well informed. That's the charge that has been laid. It was very, very well informed.
Yes. I've absolutely no idea who his sources were. But as
let me come back to my original question.
Very clearly wasn't.
Did you recognise it from your experience with the Murdoch family? And were you Tom?
Don't
Swerve here, Matthew. We won't.
I'll give it to you. So in the first series, my sense was that Tom wasn't me. I mean, clearly married to Shiv, who was Liz. But there was a secondary character in the first series who was a liberal lobbyist who Shiv was having an affair with.
Yeah, I loved him.
Yes, so I thought that was probably
the one she has an affair with on her
wedding
night,
yes,
when he's at the stag party,
and who's drawing her over to a more
progressive
thing. And so my assumption is that character was
Matthew Freud
was possibly going to develop and might have been very, very loosely based on me. So what was in Jesse's head, I don't know.
So you never gave Rupert Murdoch a very expensive watch?
No.
Can we ask what the worst bit of advice you've ever given a company was? There must have been times in the early days where you put your head in your hands and said, I sent her off to the wolves. That was wrong.
I hope I didn't.
Maybe not the wolves. Do you look back on something and think, I've learnt about that now, but that was terrible?
So I think the art of narrativity, of trying to manage storytelling, is to have some notion of how serious the consequences of getting it wrong are. It's a bit like being a sort of oncologist.
Do you think you've saved people's careers?
I think I've helped people manage their way through their turn in a way that minimises the lasting damage.
Like who? I mean, you must be able to give examples.
I'll put one to you.
Go on.
Just Mo Farah. He was a client of yours?
And friend.
And you produced a documentary about him for the BBC, correct? One of your companies.
Yeah.
And it was a documentary which was very, very favourable to Mo Farah and left out some awkward questions that arose while watching it. And, there were all sorts of allegations about, drug taking or whatever, and whether he'd performance enhancing drugs. There were all sorts of odd episodes that you thought, wow, hang on, you've got to scrutinise why this woman who took him in, he has never seen for however many years. And it felt to me like it was a puff piece. I mean, well played you for getting it on the BBC, but I know within the BBC, when I still worked there, people were going, how did this get on the TV?
No, they weren't. I mean, that's a very curious way of telling that story. I took on Mo when he was being accused because he'd been part of the Oregon Project, and his coach had clearly been bending rules. And I was asked to talk to him, and I remember the first phone call, and he was so angry. I sort of recognised that anger as real, and it took 2 to 3 years to establish that the allegations made against him were not correct, because we managed to get hold of every blood test he'd ever taken in his entire career and got that analysed, and universally someone said that, like, no one can have this set of bloods if they were doping. What was interesting about the documentary was that Mo came to see me and he said, look, I've got something to tell you, which some people, it's a common opener, because someone's got to get something off their chest. And he said, my name's not Mo Farah. And he told me his story, which was that he'd been trafficked, aged 9, arrived at Gatwick Airport, given a piece of paper with Mo Farah written on it, and told to go through customs and tell them that was his name. One of the sort of penny dropping moments is the doping allegations were primarily driven by a couple of journalists at the Times who we talked to a lot and kept giving more and more evidence and more proof that Mo was not doping. And they just went, there's something not right about the guy. There's something not right about this guy. And so as he told me the story, I went, they were right. They were right. You've been carrying this terrible secret. And it wouldn't have mattered if he worked in Asda, but as he became more famous, as he won more medals, as he broke more records, as he became Sir Mo Farah, the weight of this secret was palpable, and so that sense that people had that this was a guy with something to hide was 100% correct. So at the point where he'd stopped running, at the point where we made that film. The reason we made the film is how do you get a story like that out? Because he could have been deported. I mean, he was illegally in the country. He probably could have been stripped of medals, titles, knighthoods, right? So there was real jeopardy about how to, plus he'd published a biography where he'd completely made up his childhood. Do you do an interview? Do you do a press conference? Do you do an announcement? And what I thought was that actually he needed to explore this, and not just on his own behalf, but on behalf of the roughly 100,000 children, and it's a incredibly rough estimate. It could be a lot more, it could be less. But very clearly, he's not the only child who's been trafficked into the UK from the developing world. So it took us a year and a half to make that film. We worked with both the Home Office and the Department of Education to make sure that when this film went out, it was going to raise the issue of the fact that how did this guy fall through the net for so long, and it became unaware. So this, it wasn't a puff piece about Mo.
No, I suppose my question is
it was a story about trafficking children, and as a film, it won a Grierson, it won a BAFTA, it won a Royal Television Society Award, it won a Rose d'Or.
Yeah,
right?
I suppose the point I'm getting at is not, maybe puff piece was the kind of inelegant phrase to use. What was unusual about it was that someone who works in PR, who's got a client, then has a separate company within Freud Communications that then makes the film for the BBC about it. I mean, it was kind of like.
So the film was commissioned by the BBC. It would have been commissioned by any broadcaster that I'd taken it to, because it was
of course
extraordinary story, and it was an authored documentary. It wasn't a story about Mo.
Yeah,
it was Mo.
No, I can't think of many examples of a client where the PR company then makes the film for the BBC. I just think it speaks to the power of you and Freud Communications.
I think you're joining dots that don't quite add up. I mean, we were involved in another extraordinary documentary with Rio Ferdinand. Who'd lost his wife and was really struggling with processing grief with being a single father, and so also a BBC show, which was about Rio exploring his own circumstances and the everyman story, because he's not the only person who lost a partner and ended up struggling with bringing up young children on his own. That also won a lot of awards, and I don't think anyone pointed fingers and saying, well, that's a puff piece, isn't it? There are lots of ways of telling stories, and I think television is the most powerful and impactful. I mean, Mr. Bates and the Post Office,
Sure.
Finally exposed a scandal that had been known, but hadn't ever landed with the public. So I am interested in changing things. I mean, I guess as we all are. So I think as the print media becomes less and less powerful and less well resourced, journalism is expensive, and so TV and film probably is the most enduring tool to tell a story that's important and to land it with people so that they might change their minds, and they might collectively awareness is powerful.
I want to wrap up, Matthew, by talking about what's clearly the biggest brand in the world right now, and the question about whether Trump has broken all the rules of PR as you know them, whether it's Pussygate, the Hollywood Access tape, whether it's the criminal trials and the convictions that should have finished him off, whether it's being found liable for sexual assault that should have been the sort of nail in the coffin. The ballot is more powerful than the law. And I guess it goes back to his ability to tell a story. Do you think the old ways of PR are bust now?
Yes, in truth, I think anyone in public life now is on a very unclear path, because the vast majority of media is not neutral. The way that people absorb and process the information they're getting from both social media and conventional media is not trusting. I mean, I remember, I think Tim Bell talked about the age of deference.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a period 30, 40 years ago where we deferred to authority. And that became an age of reference, where we'd take what a doctor said or what the media said.
You listen to those in authority.
But you then look at other points of view and you'd sort of make up your own mind. I think we're now in an age of indifference. I think people have really tuned out to this idea that there was a singular point of view, or that there was a singular opinion, and that that was the truth. So I think it's not that people don't know who to trust. I think they've just zoned out of trusting anyone. And I mean, both Brexit and the election of Trump, which was, I mean, to my mind, an act of terrible collective self-harm on behalf of the UK with Brexit, and on behalf of America with a now a two-term Trump agenda. One of the conclusions you've got to draw is that people don't care.
So, I mean, that's the question, I guess. If you are trying to fix a problem now, and you think this man, whoever it is, might be a rapist, he might be a convicted criminal, he might not be telling the truth, he might be, creating a constitutional crisis or whatever. Nobody's really listening.
But so those are the problems, not whether he's getting a good press or not whether people are believing whether or not he assaulted women or whether or not he was insider trading on, you know, on crypto or the stock market, you know, over the last few months. You know, the reality is what matters, but the media and the public's ability to affect that reality has always been quite small. I mean, ballot box aside, you know, the court of public opinion never had much authority.
But it has more now, doesn't it?
Does it?
Fascinating.
We'll end it there.
Matthew Freud, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.